In the late 19th century, long before Rhodesia became a battlefield of global attention, its fate was sealed in the shadow of empire. The land of Mashonaland and Matabeleland, rich in resources and fertile soil, caught the eye of one man, Cecil Rhodes. More than just a mining magnate, Rhodes was an empire builder, a man determined to expand Britain's dominion across Africa. Through his British South Africa Company, he did not ask for permission. He forced his way in. Contracts and treaties with local chiefs were often little more than illusions, masking the reality of conquest. The Shona and Ndebele peoples resisted fiercely, but rifles and Maxim guns crushed spears and shields. By 1895, this vast territory was branded with a new name, Rhodesia, after the man who had claimed it. The company ruled with absolute authority, turning a commercial enterprise into a colonial experiment. White settlers soon poured in, seizing land and opportunity, while the African majority was pushed to the margins of their own homeland. Beneath the surface, resentment grew. The seeds of conflict, between colonizer and colonized, settler and native, were planted here. Seeds that, decades later, would ignite into one of Africa's most brutal wars. November 11, 1965. While the world watched the Cold War play out across continents, a political earthquake shook southern Africa. On this day, Rhodesia's Prime Minister Ian Smith stood before his cabinet and declared the unthinkable. Independence from Britain, not granted, but taken. This was the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, or UDI. To Smith and his supporters, it was an act of survival. They claimed they were not breaking from Britain, but forced into this path by a government in London they no longer trusted. If Britain demanded majority rule, then Rhodesia would go it alone, under minority control. The international reaction was swift and furious. Not a single nation recognized Rhodesia's independence. The United Nations and Britain slammed down economic sanctions, cutting off trade and isolating the white minority state from the world. Yet in Salisbury, the regime dug in, buoyed by quiet lifelines from South Africa and Portuguese Mozambique. But UDI had consequences far beyond diplomacy. For Rhodesia's black majority, it was proof that peaceful reform was a dead end. If the ballot box was closed to them, only the bullet remained. And so, in the shadows of the bush, the fires of war began to smolder. As Rhodesia's white government tightened its grip, the call for liberation grew louder. But unity among the oppressed was never simple. By the early 1960s, two powerful nationalist movements had emerged, both vowing to end minority rule but divided by ideology, strategy, and even ethnicity. The first was the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo. Rooted in Marxist-Leninist thought, ZAPU drew much of its support from the Ndebele people. Its military wing, ZIPRA, trained in Soviet camps, marched in formation, and prepared for open battle against Rhodesia's armed forces. Splintering from ZAPU came the Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZANU. Guided first by Nobi Ningi Sithole and later by Robert Mugabe, ZANU rallied the Shona majority and embraced Maoist ideals. Its fighters, the guerrillas of Zanla, did not rely on heavy weapons or open battle. Instead, they blended into the countryside, turning villages into strongholds and waging a relentless people's war. Two armies, two visions, one goal: to dismantle the Rhodesian state. Yet their rivalry would be as fierce as their fight against Ian Smith's regime. And in the dense bush of southern Africa, this divided resistance would ignite a conflict that could not be contained. Facing a storm of insurgency, Rhodesia turned to its greatest weapon, a security force forged in discipline, skill, and ruthless efficiency. At the front lines stood the Rhodesian Army, a small but formidable force. The Rhodesian Light Infantry, elite paratroopers known simply as the Troopies, were trained to drop from the sky at a moment's notice, striking guerrilla camps with speed and precision. Alongside them, the Rhodesian African Rifles, composed largely of black soldiers under white officers, brought local knowledge and fierce fighting spirit into the field. But Rhodesia's true edge lay in its special units. The Selous Scouts, masters of disguise and deception, infiltrated enemy ranks, often wearing guerrilla uniforms and speaking local dialects. The legendary SAS carried out high-risk raids, striking across borders with surgical brutality. Overhead, the Rhodesian Air Force guaranteed supremacy in the skies. Hunter jets, Canberra bombers, and Alouette helicopters provided airstrikes, reconnaissance, and rapid troop deployment, creating the devastating tactic known as Fire Force, where insurgents could be surrounded and annihilated within minutes. Outnumbered but never outgunned, Rhodesia's security forces became both feared and infamous. But for every guerrilla camp destroyed, another would rise, and soon the war would erupt in ways even these elite soldiers could not fully contain. The first shots of Rhodesia's long war were fired not on a battlefield but on a lonely road. In 1964, ZANU insurgents ambushed and killed a white foreman named Andrew Oberholzer. To Rhodesia's white community, it was a chilling signal the war had begun. The government struck back hard. Leaders of both ZANU and ZAPU, including Robert Mugabe, Ndabaningi Sitole, and Joshua Nkomo, were rounded up and thrown into prison. Their parties were banned. Yet, even behind bars, their cause refused to die. From exile in Zambia and Portuguese Mozambique, the guerrilla armies of Zipra and Zanla began crossing into Rhodesia. At first, their raids were small: ambushes on patrols, mines laid on dusty roads, skirmishes in remote valleys. But each attack carried a message: the bush was no longer safe. Rhodesian forces responded with operations like Nickel and Cauldron, hunting insurgents with relentless efficiency. Victories on the battlefield gave Rhodesia confidence, but the guerrillas were learning, adapting, and growing. They studied in Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean camps, preparing for a war of endurance. By the early 1970s, it was clear this was no passing rebellion. The Rhodesian Bush War had begun in earnest, and neither side would back down. By the early 1970s, the insurgency could no longer be dismissed as scattered raids. Zanla guerrillas, hardened by training in China and emboldened by support from newly independent Mozambique, surged across Rhodesia's eastern border. Villages became recruitment grounds, supply lines stretched deeper into the bush, and the once quiet countryside turned into a war zone. In 1972, Rhodesia launched its largest counterinsurgency yet, Operation Hurricane. It was a massive campaign of airstrikes, ground assaults, and intelligence operations aimed at crushing the guerrilla threat in the northeast. Rhodesian light infantry paratroopers dropped into combat zones, while Selous scouts tracked fighters through the thickets, and the Air Force unleashed bombardments from above. For a time, the campaign seemed to work. Camps were destroyed, insurgents scattered, but victory was fleeting. The borders were too vast, the bush too dense, and the will of the guerrillas unbroken. Each time Rhodesia struck, Zanla simply melted away, only to return stronger. The fall of Portuguese rule in Mozambique in 1974 dealt Rhodesia a devastating blow, opening hundreds of miles of border to insurgents. What had once been a containable conflict was now a wildfire. And for Ian Smith's government, the war was about to enter its deadliest phase. By the early 1970s, the insurgency could no longer be dismissed as scattered raids. Zanla guerrillas, hardened by training in China and emboldened by support from newly independent Mozambique, surged across Rhodesia's eastern border. Villages became recruitment grounds, supply lines stretched deeper into the bush, and the once quiet countryside turned into a war zone. In 1972, Rhodesia launched its largest counterinsurgency yet, Operation Hurricane. It was a massive campaign of airstrikes, ground assaults, and intelligence operations aimed at crushing the guerrilla threat in the northeast. Rhodesian light infantry paratroopers dropped into combat zones, while Selous scouts tracked fighters through the thickets, and the Air Force unleashed bombardments from above. For a time, the campaign seemed to work. Camps were destroyed, insurgents scattered, but victory was fleeting. The borders were too vast, the bush too dense, and the will of the guerrillas unbroken. Each time Rhodesia struck, Zanla simply melted away, only to return stronger. The fall of Portuguese rule in Mozambique in 1974 dealt Rhodesia a devastating blow, opening hundreds of miles of border to insurgents. What had once been a containable conflict was now a wildfire. And for Ian Smith's government, the war was about to enter its deadliest phase. By the mid-1970s, the war was no longer confined within Rhodesia's borders. With Mozambique now independent under the Marxist Frelimo government, Zanla guerrillas gained safe havens stretching the entire eastern frontier. From these sanctuaries, thousands of fighters poured into Rhodesia, determined to bring the war to every farm, road, and village. Rhodesia struck back with daring cross-border raids. The most infamous came in August 1976, Operation Eland, also known as the Nyadzonia Raid. Disguised as Mozambican soldiers, the elite Selous scouts infiltrated a massive Zanla camp. When the signal was given, they opened fire. By the end, hundreds lay dead, guerrillas, but also civilians, women, and children. Amnesty International claimed the toll was over 1,000. The world recoiled, and South Africa, Rhodesia's lifeline, began pulling away. Still, the raids continued. In 1977, Operation Dingo targeted Zanla's headquarters at Chimoio in Mozambique. Rhodesian paratroopers, SAS commandos, and airstrikes devastated the base, killing over 1,000 fighters. Militarily, it was a triumph. Politically, it was a disaster, fueling ZANU's propaganda and rallying new recruits to their cause. The war had escalated beyond Rhodesia's control. Each victory brought heavier losses. Each raid deepened isolation, and the guerrillas were only growing stronger. By 1978, Rhodesia was a nation at war on every front. Zanla guerrillas surged westward, while Zipra, trained and armed by the Soviets, prepared for a conventional showdown in the north. Villages became battlegrounds, roads death traps of landmines, and the skies haunted by the threat of shoulder-fired missiles. The insurgents also struck at symbols of White Rhodesia's security. Zipra fighters shot down 2 civilian Viscount airliners, killing dozens. Zanla guerrillas massacred missionaries at Elim, shocking even their supporters. To many, it seemed Rhodesia was unraveling in blood and terror. Ian Smith's government tried a desperate gamble. In 1979, he signed an internal settlement with moderate black leaders, creating the short-lived state of Zimbabwe-Rhodesia under Prime Minister Abel Muzorewa. But the move excluded ZANU and ZAPU, and without them, no one recognized the new government. The war only intensified. Inside Rhodesia, manpower was running thin. White soldiers were stretched to the limit, morale crumbled, and efforts to draft black conscripts failed. Even South Africa, once Rhodesia's strongest ally, began urging a political solution. By the end of 1979, it was clear. Rhodesia could not win on the battlefield. The war had to be ended at the negotiating table. By late 1979, Rhodesia was exhausted. The Bush War had consumed 15 years, leaving thousands dead, the countryside scarred, and a society on the brink of collapse. Guerrillas of Zanla and Zipra now numbered in the tens of thousands, while Rhodesian forces were stretched to breaking point. Even South Africa, once Rhodesia's shield, withdrew its support. The end was inevitable. In December 1979, all sides gathered in London at Lancaster House. Around the table sat Ian Smith's government, Abel Muzorewa's short-lived administration, and the leaders of ZANU and ZAPU, Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo. For 3 months, they argued, threatened, and bargained. At stake was the future of Rhodesia itself. The agreement they signed ended the war. Rhodesia would return temporarily to British control, a ceasefire would be enforced, and, most importantly, elections would be held under universal suffrage. For the first time, the black majority would decide the nation's destiny. In early 1980, the vote was cast. Despite allegations of intimidation, Robert Mugabe's ZANU won by a landslide. On April 18th, the Union Jack was lowered, and a new flag rose over Salisbury. Rhodesia was gone. In its place stood Zimbabwe, a nation born in fire, struggle, and sacrifice. From the ashes of war and years of bitter struggle, a new nation was born. Rhodesia, once a fortress of minority rule, crumbled beneath the weight of resistance, diplomacy, and destiny. In 1980, as the old flag was lowered and the banner of Zimbabwe rose, the world witnessed more than just a change of name. It was the rebirth of a people. A land scarred by conflict now stood at the crossroads of hope and uncertainty. This was not merely the end of Rhodesia, but the beginning of a new chapter, the dawn of Zimbabwe.